Hey guys, this is Miss Harlequin, and in this video we are going to be brainstorming the details and evidence for our Unit 5 performance-based task. So that's basically our learning target for today's lesson. We want to take the task and we want to begin basically collecting evidence and planning the details that are going to go into the body paragraphs of our essay. Alright, so we have looked at the performance-based task. Let's review it one more time. Basically, for this end of the unit writing piece, we're going to be choosing one author, and we're going to be arguing which narrative strategies best convey or show the author's perspective about the city. So the first thing we have to do is we have to choose a writer. So when they tell us to choose a writer, which writers are we choosing from? Well, we can choose the first writer, Langston Hughes, the poet who wrote our first poem, City. We could choose Jessie Wilmore Merton, the author of the poem Song of the Builders. We read a third poem, but we're actually not going to be using that for our performance-based task, and I'm going to talk about that in a moment. So our final choice is Frank Baum, who wrote the excerpt from The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. Now, we're not going to choose Francisco Alarcon and the poem Our City, because if we look again at the task, we'll see that this task is asking us to write about strategies, plural. And that poem, although very nice, and we did a close reading of it, and there was a lot to talk about, is a little bit too short to really base our entire essay on. All right, so now let's focus on the other word I highlighted here, perspective. What does it mean to talk about the author's perspective? Well, basically what we need to talk about is what the author thinks, feels, or believes about the city that they are writing about. So how does Langston Hughes feel about the city he described in his poem? How does Jessie Wilmore Merton feel about the city that is being built in Song of the Builders? How does Frank Baum feel about the city in Oz, specifically the Emerald City? All right, so the very first thing that we're going to do is we're going to choose which author we want to write about, and we're going to think about how that author feels about the city they wrote about. Now, if we start with Frank Baum, we could say a couple of different things. From the way he describes the city, the people living in the city, we could say that the city's a fanciful place, that he has an optimistic view of the city. So when he looks at it, he's seeing the good things about it. He's not really focusing on the negative. And that he views the city as prosperous. We could also say that he feels the city is a place where fanciful things occur or magical things occur. When we look at Jessie Wilmore Merton, how does she feel, not about the builders, but how does she feel about the city that they're building? The fact that they're building these buildings and dying in order to help create the city and help the city grow. We can say that she thinks that the workers are giving their lives for no good reason. That's the way she views the city, because it's the city and the owners who are making them do this. So we could also say that she thinks the owners are heartless and cruel. The owners represent the city. And that she feels like the lives of the workers are not worth losing just for a building. For Langston Hughes, we can say that he thinks or feels that his city is a beautiful place. And you'll see I left the heart blank because basically that's the same thing. This is what he feels, it's what he thinks. There's not a lot to that poem, so there's not really a lot of different ways to kind of phrase this. Although if you can think of another way to express Langston Hughes' perspective, please feel free to. All right, so now what we want to do is we want to think about, now that we know what the author's perspective is, let's go back into the text. And what is a strategy? One way that the author shows us their perspective. If we think that Frank Baum thinks the city is a fanciful place, where do we actually get that from? What paragraph, what lines, what sentences show us that it's a fanciful place? And then once we have that evidence, well, in those sentences, what technique is the author using? How is the author showing us their perspective? If we use the model essay as an example, we could say that Nafisi feels that Tehran is changing, and because it's changing from when she was a child, she feels sad. How does she show us that she's sad? She uses a strategy of anecdotes. All right, so what I want to do is I want to use my evidence chart. It's going to have 4 columns to collect my evidence. I'm going to start out in the first column. How does the author feel about their city? So my author, Nafisi, feels like Tehran has changed. And I could probably go on a little bit more. Not only does she feel that it's changed, but she is sad about these changes. Where did I learn that from? All right, I learned that from the very beginning of her excerpt where she gives an anecdote. She tells a little small story from her past about her memory of walking with her friend. So that's going to be my evidence. When Nafisi describes walking home from the pastry shop with her friend and what she would see, she describes the protective gleam of the snow. Then she describes how Tehran is now. So she shows a contrast, how Tehran is now polluted. The snow's polluted. Her friend is in exile. All right, so I've got my evidence. I have the strategy. This evidence is an example of an anecdote. Why is this strategy so effective in conveying or showing the author's perspective? So basically, what am I learning about the author's perspective from this piece of evidence? Why is this strategy better than another one? She didn't have to use an anecdote. She could have used descriptive details. She could have used point of view. She could have used characterization. She chose an anecdote. Why? Why is that anecdote a really good choice? Through the use of this anecdote, the reader understands. So the anecdote's helping me understand how much Tehran has changed, and we can see the positive feelings that the author used to have about her homeland. So really, when you fill out this last category, what you're looking for is some really strong verbs to show what the author... strong verbs to show what the author is doing. Think about the effect that the evidence or strategy has on you as the reader. And so then you're going to want to analyze or explain it using a sentence frame like the one that's on the screen. And so instead of the dash, you'd actually fill in the blank after the sentence. The strategy is effective because it helps the author. What does it help the author do? It helps the author convey something. What does it help the author convey? Does it help the author reveal something? What does it help the author reveal? Describe, emphasize, show, or teach. These are just a few examples of really strong verbs that can help lead you into your explanatory sentence. All right, so now it's time to work on your evidence chart and your planning on your own. So again, you have to choose your author and your text. You have to figure out what strategies the author used, because we already figured out what the author's perspective is. So now we're really just kind of looking for the evidence that matches that perspective. And when we find that evidence, we're focusing on what strategy that is. You need to have at least 2 strategies that you're going to focus on. So when you complete the evidence chart, find the evidence that shows that strategy use, analyze what the evidence and strategy reveal about the author's perspective. All right, I just want to, before we go off and work on our evidence charts, just break down the chart a little further. Remember, in the first column, you are saying the author's perspective. The author sees the city as, feels that the city is, or thinks that the city is. In the second column, you are giving your actual evidence. It has to be a quote from the text, and you have to include your citation, either the page number or the line numbers for the poems. In the third column, you're saying exactly what strategy is being used. And in the last column, you are explaining how that example, how that evidence and strategy shows the author's perspective. And so you can use one of these sentence frames, or if you rewind the video, you can look at this slide right here where I gave you a sentence frame and a couple of example verbs. So the first box on the first page of your chart should be the first strategy. On the back, it should be the second strategy, and then your third box should either be a third strategy or it should be a second example for the first or the second strategy. You might even want to give 2 examples per strategy, so you might even want to add a 4th box. Give 2 pieces of evidence for strategy 1, and then 2 pieces of evidence for strategy 2. And finally, when you think you are done with this chart, check yourself before you wreck yourself. When you come to class, if your chart is not correct, the whole rest of your essay is going to be incorrect. So check your work. Did you explain how the author feels about the city they wrote about? Does your evidence accurately show the author's perspective? Did you choose the correct strategy? So is it really a simile? If you said it's a simile, are you sure? Double check the definition of similes to make sure. Remember in class you got a list of strategies that our Unit 5 authors used. Use it. It's going to be incredibly helpful.